So this week we are going to be talking about the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal. And so we're going to be talking about this commandment in three different ways. First, we're going to talk about the story of Lot and Abraham, and how Abraham decided to split the promised land with Lot so that they would both have enough. And second, we're going to talk about what it means not to steal, and how that extends to helping others keep what they have. And third, we're going to talk about how this commandment not to steal means that we change the world by emphasizing the fact that everyone is supposed to have what they need. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the story about Abraham and Lot. Now, this story is from Genesis 13 about two guys named Abraham and Lot. You've probably heard of Abraham, but maybe not Lot. See, Lot was Abraham's nephew, who went with him from the land of Haran on the way to the promised land in Canaan, the land that God promised to Abraham and his descendants forever. Something you should know is that after years of wandering and a lot of different hijinks, both Abraham and Lot were very, very rich. And back in those days, you were rich when you had a whole lot of sheep and goats and slaves and servants, a lot of stuff. Lot and Abraham traveled around a lot together, and their herds just kept getting bigger and bigger. Well, one day, some of Lot's servants got into a fight with Abraham's servants over a patch of grazing land. The flocks were so big that they couldn't graze in the same place. There just wasn't enough grass. But because Lot and Abraham were traveling together, there was only so much grazing land in any given area. So obviously, it ended up being a conflict. Word made its way back to Abraham about this fight that had happened, and Abraham decided he had to do something about it. Now, you see, the promised land was promised to Abraham, not to Lot. God hadn't promised anything to Abraham's nephew. If Abraham wanted to, he could have told Lot that he needed to go and find somewhere else to live. Take his flocks with him. That way Abraham would have enough room for all of his sheep and goats. It would solve the problem of their servants getting into a fight because they wouldn't be competing over the same grazing land. But Abraham decided to do something else. He took Lot to a high mountain and he showed him the whole promised land. And it was big. There was lots of room, way more room than any one man's flocks could possibly need. Abraham explained to Lot that if he picked one part of the land, then Abraham would go to the other, and vice versa. They would have plenty of room, each of them, for all of their flocks, and wouldn't have to run into any more of these fights between their servants. So Abraham, despite the fact that the land was technically his and only promised to him, he offered to split it with Lot. Abraham was very generous this way. But of course, not all land is created equal. Lot took a look at the whole land, and he saw on one side there were hills and rocks and rough terrain. And on the other side, he saw a big flat plain with a beautiful river running through it and lots of well-watered grassland. He chose to take the well-watered plain and left the hill country to his uncle Abraham. And that's not terribly nice, now is it? But Abraham knew that even the less awesome part of the promised land would be more than enough for him and his flocks. So he agreed. And the two of them went their separate ways. They each grew richer on their own. They both had plenty of room for their flocks because there was always enough there in the promised land for both of them. They just had to figure out how to share it. Realizing that there is more than enough for everyone, and that we are called to share in the abundance that God gives us, is the whole foundation of this commandment. And Abraham shows us how we can follow it by sharing what he had, which was already more than enough, with his nephew. So what does it mean not to steal? Well, hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Don't take things that don't belong to you. This is true of anything that belongs to someone else, whether it is something that you find in a store or something in someone's home or anywhere else that you find something that doesn't belong to you. For example, downloading a song that you haven't paid for or using someone's art without permission. That is also stealing. Stealing is anytime you take something that someone else has put time or effort or money to get. If it doesn't belong to you, you don't get to take it without permission. But, kind of like the commandment to kill that we talked about earlier, not stealing has more to it than just that. See, Martin Luther put it this way: we are to fear and love God so that we neither take our neighbor's money nor property, nor acquire them by using shoddy merchandise or crooked deals, but instead help them to improve and protect their property and income. Now, Luther obviously points out the fact that stealing means taking our neighbor's things, what he calls property and income, but he includes two more things that I want us to pay attention to. See, the first is that he mentions not acquiring our neighbor's things through shoddy merchandise or crooked deals. Now, what do you think that means? Think of it like this. Is it right for someone to sell you a computer that you later find out doesn't work? What if someone sells you a collectible item that they claim is super valuable, but you later find out is not worth anything at all, and they knew it? Now, sure, they didn't take anything from you without your permission. You did agree to pay for it after all. But this commandment means that we are not supposed to take advantage of people by selling them crappy merchandise or tricking people into buying things that aren't worth what they are paying. And the other part of Luther's description of this commandment is that we are called to improve and protect our neighbor's property and income. So it's not just about not stealing, it's also about helping our neighbor prosper. Advocate for better pay. Talk up the small business that your neighbor owns. Shop at the store that your neighbor owns. Help them make connections so that they can do their job better. This commandment also means that we are called to help our neighbor with their material needs. And sometimes that will also look like what Abraham did with Lot. It looks like seeing where we have more than enough and sharing that with our neighbor. God doesn't give us material blessings for us just to hoard them. God gives us more stuff than we need so that we have stuff that we can share with those who don't have enough. Abraham, who had the whole promised land all to himself, did what God called him to do and shared in his abundance with his nephew. How does it affect the real world? Well, there are two things that would happen if we were to really fulfill this commandment. The first would be that everyone would have everything that they needed. And the second is that we would start to trust each other much more than we already do. Think about the first thing. This commandment not to steal covers not just keeping ourselves from taking what isn't ours, but also not cheating people out of what they have and making sure that our neighbor has enough that they need. If you think about it, if we fulfilled just that last part, making sure our neighbor has what they need, then the other two would pretty much fall into place. After all, who would steal if they already have what they need? Who would need to trick someone into paying for crappy merchandise if they already had all their needs taken care of? God calls on us to follow this commandment because God wants everyone to have enough. Think about Abraham and Lot. When you have more than you need, God wants you to share it with those who don't. When you have the opportunity to help your neighbor with what they need, God is giving you a chance to share in the abundance of blessings that you have been given. If we all did that, if we all shared that abundance that God gives us, we wouldn't feel so committed to hoarding what we have because our needs would always be taken care of from the abundance of our neighbor. Everyone would have enough because God always gives us enough to share. And the second thing is that we would trust each other more. How often do we avoid eye contact with those salespeople in the mall? when we could still do that, because we knew that they'll just try to get us to buy a product of something that we don't need that costs way too much. We lock our doors and won't help people because we automatically assume that others are trying to steal from us or take advantage of us. God gives us this commandment because there is a plan in mind for the things that you have. We're not really meant to have a whole bunch of stuff if our neighbor doesn't have enough. We're not meant to trick people or take advantage of people and claim that it's just the way that the world works. We're called to be anti-thieves, being generous with what we have because God is generous with us. It would change the world if we followed this commandment to its fullest meaning. Everyone would have enough. Everyone would make sure that everyone else had what they needed. There would be no need to steal or cheat or swindle. It's quite a vision that God calls us to aim at. But God wants us to try because it will change the world, even if we get halfway there. So let's review what we learned tonight. First, we learned about the story of Lot and Abraham, how Abraham decided to split the promised land with his nephew so that they would both have enough. And we also learned what it means not to steal and how that extends to helping others keep what is theirs. And third, we learned that the commandment not to steal means that we change the world by emphasizing that everyone is supposed to have enough for all of their needs. And that is the seventh commandment.